That's my favorite poem from Second Wave Feminism. It's sort of bubbling anger builds up as it goes. Our theme for April is wholeness, the practice of repairing what is broken and knowing we are enough. To be human is to have challenges, in case you haven't noticed. For some of us, it's a foul temper. For some, anxiety. For some, low self-esteem. For some, it's addiction. Something. Those things are really broken. They reduce enjoyment and fulfillment in life. They affect our lives for the worse. And they need to be fixed. Then there are those things that are social pressures that say that's broken when they're not broken at all. Gender identity, sexual orientation, body style, looks, employment, economic status, you always, you never, the list goes on and on. As Marge Piercy wrote in her poem, she was advised to play coy, exhorted to come on hearty, exercise, diet, smile, and wheedle. The girl in the poem wasn't broken, but she broke under the pressures of social expectations. And that's one idea that I want to consider today. The other idea I want to consider today is maintenance of the machine of brokenness, if you will. How the apparatus of negative social pressure keeps functioning and how many people will go how far to keep that machine running, which I think explains the worldwide rise of authoritarianism and the world that George was telling us about. Now, my nomination for the greatest book title of all time is the 1864 papal publication Syllabus Errorum, the syllabus of errors, which is a class I want to take, right? Sign us up. The book was written by Pope Pius IX, and it has a list of 80 heresies. Count them. In that work, Pope Pius IX put his foot down. After all, the Latin word heresy means choosing for yourself. In the 1860s, more and more people were choosing for themselves, and that would never do, said the Pope. The syllabus of errors condemned everything from modernism to moral relativism to secularity to separation of church and state to liberalism in general. Everything, in other words, that humanists treasure. Now, I suspect the Pope was thinking something like this. You let people choose for themselves, and the next thing you know, women will OMG, right? I think the Pope was thinking, OMG, I got to crack down on some errors here. With the syllabus of errors, Pope Pius IX added his name to the long list of men who have said, this can't go on. I call them the authoritarians. Secularity and individual choice feel chaotic to many people, especially those who benefit from hierarchy and patriarchy. You're telling me I'm going to have to think about my moral choices instead of just going with my prejudices? OMG! That's difficult and chaotic, and it feels dangerous. The conservatives get frightened, and the authoritarians step up to stoke the fear in order to gain power. Authoritarians multiply in the lush environment produced by fear and anger. Unfortunately, fear and anger have only gotten more ubiquitous since the Pope's time. Nowadays, we are constantly bombarded by news, and news is almost necessarily about what's broken, what doesn't work. People are scared, and so we search for quick fixes. We depend on anger and fear. And we have authoritarians who offer us quick fixes. What can make America great again? What can make Europe great again? What can make Christianity great again? Authoritarians always have an answer to some of those questions. And all you got to do is trade in some freedom for safety. Now, I want to define freedom very specifically, and I'm going to depend upon the definition of the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. He said this, quote, "We are free when we can remake the conditions of our own existence. We can dominate the things that dominate us." I'll read that again. We are free when we can remake the conditions of our own existence, when we can dominate the things that dominate us. That's freedom. I think he's right. It's certainly the ideal of humanism, and it's the opposite of any attempt to time travel backwards to the good old days and the great whatever. All the various and sundry authoritarian projects and fundamentalisms work in exactly the same way. They are insisting upon a certainty that sometimes did exist in the past. What George was reading about. Yeah, they did, but they certainly existed. That certainty existed due to parochialism and isolation. They didn't know anything else. Authoritarians are insisting upon certainties that cannot exist on our very small planet today. As fundamentalisms insist upon certainty, they get more and more shrill. They get more and more fearful and unreasoning and unjustified. Those conditions, fear, unreason, and injustice, are the exact opposite of what humanists stand for as we work toward a pluralist and secular world. One of the readings this morning is from Washington Post columnist Robert Kagan. He's a neoconservative, American historian, foreign policy expert. He's been an advisor to various of our presidents. Now, why do we need to quote from somebody sort of on the opposite side of most of us politically? Well, I think because Kagan hits the nail on the head in the article concerning the true threat to liberal democracy here and abroad. It's not communism. It's not fascism. It's not totalitarianism. It's authoritarianism. The trust in populist leaders who rule first by their personalities and their surety, and then by force. I think Kagan has a point that we need to think about very deeply. A recent study by the Brookings Institution, which is a center-right think tank, although some of Trump's people have been calling it leftist recently, right? But Kagan is a member of the Brookings Institution think tank. They released this report, quote, it's a little hard to catch, but I'll repeat it. Of the Americans who regard themselves as economically liberal but culturally conservative, which is the standard description of populism, by the way, 40% express openness to non-democratic forms of government, and fully 52% support a strong leader without checks and balances from Congress or elections. This group dominated, this is the scary part, this group dominated the crucial 9% of voters who voted for Barack Obama in 2012, but shifted to Trump in 2016. So, populists, those who are economically liberal but culturally conservative, 52% support strong leaders without checks and balances. End quote. No, I don't agree with the neoconservative view that the U.S. should be out on the world stage forcing democracy on other nations. That's always a mistake, I'm afraid. But I do think that having a few liberal democracies on our planet is a pretty good idea. The key to authoritarianism is fear and anger It's always been the same. President Franklin Roosevelt famously said, "Fear itself," right, in his first inaugural speech. "Fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, and unjustified," he said. Fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified. Again, those are three things humanists oppose. We humanists get a lot of gaff about our dedication to reason and naming and justification. To put it succinctly, we get gaff about our dedication to those Enlightenment values in the reading today. Yes, the Enlightenment period, beginning around 1700, was a time of European colonialism. And yes, science in those days was used as a tool to oppress non-Europeans and women and people identified as other. All those things are true. We all know that there is this thing called motivated reasoning. When people use it, the result is, well, unreason. They get the answer they already wanted in the first place. And of course, motivated reason continues into our own time. No, reason is not a cure-all for the human condition. It's a tool, and it's a valuable tool. As a matter of fact, the wrongs attributed to the Enlightenment period also are demonstrably more true of that time just before the Enlightenment. For example, you may have seen this in the news. Recently, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador asked Spain and the Vatican for an apology for the Spanish Roman Catholic invasion and occupation of Mexico 5 centuries ago. Old news, well, not so much considering the continuing poverty of indigenous peoples in Mexico. President Obrador wants an apology to the original peoples for the violations of what are now known as human rights. This is a direct quote. He wants an apology to the original peoples for the violations of what are now known to be human rights. Well, if you've been watching the news, no apology. Heck no. Obrador chose his words very carefully. For the violation of what are now known as human rights. Now known because of the imposition of the Enlightenment values along about 1700. Traditionally, religions have mitigated against individual freedom and individual expression, clearing the way for communal and state action, big actions in the case of Spain, Portugal, France, and Protestant England. Massive genocidal state action in this hemisphere. The pressure of the Enlightenment values is, maybe a little bit paradoxically, to lighten up. Say, lighten up, guys. We humanists and freethinkers insist that other people have the same rights and the same social responsibilities that we do. That's a start. As I always say, we believe people are more important than ideas. No, historically, that's not the way the Euro-liberal democracies have actually functioned in reality. People of color, women, foreigners, the other able, the poor, those of different religious beliefs, sexual orientations, etc., have been left out and then sometimes fought back in. But at least some of us consider those oppressions contradictory to the basic idea and claim for the existence of liberal governments, that everyone be treated with inherent, inborn worth and dignity. Rights and responsibilities, we say, are universal. Every human being, everywhere, is born with them. Now, yeah, this is an ideal. It's not a reality. The ideal wasn't achieved in the 1700s. We haven't got there yet, but it is a vision that is worthy to work toward. And it's all because we insist upon not succumbing to fear itself. It's all because we insist upon naming those things that are dangerous, because we insist upon reasoning about those things we see as dangerous, and because we insist upon justifiably deciding what the real dangers are and what to do about them. Let's be blunt. Enlightenment values frighten authoritarians and the socially conservative. It's just that simple. The Enlightenment vision of individual and universal rights leads to secularity and pluralism. Put that in your syllabus of error. It leads to separating laws from religions, getting rid of theocracies, and accepting the belief systems of other cultures, not grudgingly, but as equally valid as the belief systems of dominant cultures. That's the ideal. Secularity and pluralism function, I think, to humble us. After all, reflect on the fact that when Enlightenment philosophers began to insist that each citizen has equal rights, what they were actually doing was going back to the place humanity started in hunter-gatherer societies where demonstrably everyone is equal. But that's another story for another day. The Enlightenment project is about pluralism and diversity. You've got to have them if the human individual is to have rights and dignity. But for many, pluralism and diversity feel strange and dangerous and chaotic. Hence, fundamentalism in its many guises. Hence, the rise of authoritarians who promise to return us to certainties that, never actually existed, but we'll try. And so, all across our planet today, authoritarians are on the rise, and people are choosing to sell their freedom for an illusory certainty. That's why we who believe in the liberal project must keep reminding ourselves that there is a difference between broken and really broken. Yes, we have a broken immigration system in the U.S. It's broken because we haven't really sat down to reason it out. Sure, it's a big problem and it's getting bigger because we don't deal with it except in makeshift half measures. Name it, reason about it, and come up with just solutions. The great error of Enlightenment ideology is that it will somehow automatically and magically sustain itself, that bending toward justice thing. The quote in this morning's order of service up there at the top by Robert Kagan says the truth, I fear. We have been living with the comforting myth that the great progress we have witnessed in human behavior since the mid-20th century cannot be reversed. Actually, that's absurd. There is no universal spirit of the age pushing toward secular freedom, the inherent worth of individuals, or treating all justly. Far from it. Here is where it comes down to the individual, because those authoritarians and those who long for the good old days, what they want deep, deep inside is a return to that traditionalist social structure that George was reading about. Certitude, monoculturalism. But back to the personal. Who said to that young woman in Marge Piercy's poem, "Play coy," who exhorted her to come on hardy? It wasn't one guy. It wasn't 10 guys. It was a system in which white, male, heterosexual, cisgender people ruled the roost, and then others piled on, complicit in a system of oppression. It was microaggression after microaggression after microaggression until, as the poem says, her good nature wore out like a fan belt. Researchers have recently begun to study a phenomenon they are calling stereotype threat. Stereotype threat. Their research indicates that even mentioning a stereotype to a person who is often stereotyped, that person will score badly or worse on tests after that comment. Stereotype threat. It's subtle, it's everywhere, and it gets people. Robert Kagan phrased it well. Average people had little control of their destiny. They were imprisoned by the rigid hierarchies of traditional society, maintained by brute force when necessary, that locked them into the station in which they were born. The girl in Marge Piercy's poem was not broken, but she broke under the pressure of social expectation. The very act of questioning social expectations rather than knuckling under and buying the social norms is an act of heresy. It's an act of reason as well. We will soon be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion. On the night that the police raided that gay bar called Stonewall, there were some very brave people around there who said, "We aren't broken. It's you, society, that's broken." Stonewall was the Enlightenment in action. Religions, the traditional ones anyway, well, some of them are still not catching up 50 years later. Our call is to face fear. It's to name what's dangerous, and we are called then to lose that fear, to name it, reason about it, and seek the justice that only reason can create.